Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
Welcome to New Treetelling, the podcast where we explore all the ways old tales are made new. I am your host, Jasmine Garcia, and joining me today are...
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm just Ellie, I guess. I'm film and TV occasional critic and podcaster, and I play D&D with Jasmine, which is how she roped me into this.
Awesome. And I'm Laura, a friend of Jasmine's from college from so long ago. And I do voice acting and other stuff.
And today we are going to be reviewing the Romeo and Juliet sequel, With a Kiss I Die, in which Juliet is a vampire and falls in love with another girl in Greece.
It is a lot less interesting than that summary makes it sound.
And that is what frustrates me so much, but we will get into that. So what I always like to do for these is just kind of go over what is everyone's relationship with the original William Shakespeare classic, Romeo and Juliet?
I've read it a couple times. I was a theater major, so obviously we've read Romeo and Juliet a couple different times, lots of Shakespeare stuff. And I've gotten more excited about it, I think, as I've gotten older. I've gotten more into it. Mm-hmm. Definitely, Jasmine can attest that during college I was very much like, I don't want anything to do with Shakespeare ever.
Yep, you did a whole vlog about it.
I did.
So obviously I've read Romeo and Juliet. You know, I've been to high school. And I've seen a bunch of different movie adaptations. I don't really feel like it's one of my favorite Shakespeare's. I find it a little, I don't want to say melodramatic because they're all melodramatic. I find it a little like just quaint. It's very straightforward. There's not a lot of alternate reads you can have on it the way you can have on like Hamlet or Macbeth so I feel like a lot of times adaptations just kind of just do the thing.
That is true. The funny thing is, like, I feel like Romeo and Juliet's one of those stories where it feels cliche just because it was so influential. I feel like it is kind of hard to figure out where one starts and one ends. As for me, this is going to take a bit because my first proper introduction was my 5th grade teacher did a whole Shakespeare intro unit for us, actually. So we read a picture book version of Midsummer Night's Dream together, watched his college production of West Side Story, and I know, right? He was riff. And then we kind of read this very, very adapted for 10 to 11-year-old brains, of course, version of Romeo and Juliet. I actually did Juliet's death scene for an assignment. So I have a long history with Shakespeare in general, as well as this play. And around the time I was like 12, there was a point where I was reading this play pretty much over and over because, I don't know, it spoke to little 12-year-old me, which I guess makes sense considering the age of Juliet. She's not yet 14. More nurses need to have like a desperate read on that. And also 9 times out of 10 I would be imagining whoever my crush was at the time as Romeo. This was before I found out about myself.
I mean, I think that's sort of the thing, like, mm-hmm. I think that Romeo and Juliet does tap into something very, very straightforwardly engaging. Like, it is romantic, and it is, you know, I like tragic romance as much as the next lesbian, but I feel like unlike stuff like Macbeth or Hamlet or King, you know, there's so many, the base version has been built off of into so many wildly different directions that I feel like the original just feels very, you know, you could have cherry Coke, you could have vanilla Coke, you can have Coke with lime, or you could just have like Coke, and it's not even the version that has cocaine in it anymore.
You're not wrong. Like, really the only real twist you could have on it is the setting and the casting, pretty much. Because I've seen several productions. Obviously, I've seen the Baz Luhrmann version. Obviously, I've seen West Side Story. And because I went to a bougie high school, our drama club did go on a trip to London every 3 years. And when I went in my senior year, we did see a production of Romeo and Juliet. What was really interesting about this one is basically all of the adults were at first all in like the traditional costumes, while Romeo and Juliet were dressed modern. And then towards the end, Romeo and Juliet are dressed in the period costumes while their families all running in to see their bodies are dressed in modern clothing. So I thought that was actually a really interesting way of doing things. But that hasn't stopped people from trying, because I've definitely read and seen a few attempts to do so. First I can think of is Romiette and Julio. That was kind of a YA story. Even back then, because I did enjoy the book, but even back then I was like, it's kind of weird that they're trying to associate it with Romeo and Juliet, because other than their different backgrounds, there's really nothing trying to keep them apart. Their parents are totally cool with it. So
one of the things that I think sort of gets ignored in a lot of adaptations, and this is one place where I feel like West Side Story actually kind of, I think it is aware of this, but it doesn't really engage with it. The conflict has to be pointless and equally pointless on both sides. And one of the things that I think makes West Side Story both very interesting and kind of one of the places where it drops the ball is that the conflict there is pointless, but these households are not alike in dignity. Like the conflict explicitly started because the leader of the shark.
I would say the conflict started because the Jets are fucking racist.
Right, that's what I was saying. Like there's a scene where they're like debating like who did this first, who did that first, and the end of the conversation is the leader of the shark, and who jumped me my first day in New York, and all they can respond is, who asked you to move here? Like these households are not alike in dignity is my point, and I feel like that's a thing that people skip over a lot with adaptations that I don't know if you should.
Yeah, and another thing I feel like people really do miss, because people are very hypercritical of Romeo and Juliet, I feel like, there's a sense that they're dumb teenagers who killed 6 people, and it's just like, no, these are children. What are the adults doing? It's
Stupid
just...
shit.
I feel like it very much... It goes back and forth between those. It's either put solely on like, oh, it's Romeo and Juliet because they're children and they're stupid, or it's like they're children and so they like can't. There's no way for them to do anything. So it's all the parents' fault because the parents are doing everything. But it's hard to strike, I think, that balance that I think a really good telling of the story needs, because I feel like if Romeo and Juliet are just like dumb children, then it's just kind of like, okay, we're just
for sure.
run around.
Yeah, no, like they do have, like, Juliet especially does have a lot of sense. Like, if you read the text, she's very aware that they are treading on thin ice here. But the way I see it, they should have had the freedom to be dumb kids, because that's what being a teenager is for. And
it kind of gets muddled because in the context of a real world examination of the events, yes, they can't really be held responsible. They're teenagers. The adults don't act like adults. But on the other hand, it's a story, and the axis of the story is always going to turn on the protagonist's actions. So,
of course. Yeah, of course Romeo should have taken like 5 minutes to just cry for a bit or something, like that one Tumblr post always says. If he had just taken 5 minutes to cry, everything would have been fine.
I don't know. Maybe he could just like tell, like, I'm going to fake my death, babe.
I mean, they tried. I mean, keep in mind, they tried to. The letter didn't get to him, which is part of the tragedy of it all.
That is part of the tragedy.
But yeah, and at least for me, as a queer person, the whole idea that the adults are being stupid and not letting the kids be kids and do what they want, basically, as long as it's not hurting anybody. I think even back before I really knew, it spoke to me in that regard.
There's definitely the availability of a queer reading of the text. It's obviously not there intentionally, but you can snap the pieces into place if you want to. I'm not super inclined towards that myself. We'll talk about a little bit more about how I feel about tragic queer romances when we get to the end of this movie that we're talking about.
Oh, do not get me started. I mean, we will be getting me started. That's the point of this.
That's true.
Podcast.
Yes. I will say there's also this production that recently came out. Alfred Enoch was Romeo in it, and they really put an emphasis on mental health. Like, while they were doing the show, like they had different statistics and different quotes about basically teen depression in the backdrop, and I think that's also something you could possibly read into that.
And then there was that production, and I think it was London. I don't even know if they actually got it off the ground, but they're like, we're announcing an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet where Romeo is a Nazi and Juliet is Jewish. Like, no, do not do this.
I thought that was a joke.
What?
So that was a real thing.
What?
You
I
two
thought they
look
were kidding.
fair.
I thought
Oh,
it was
you
a
two look
joke.
fair. I think that they got such intense backlash to it that they canceled it. But also like,
God, obviously.
this is the worst
No.
idea you've had.
This is proof we're not in the darkest timeline. This is proof we're not actually in the darkest timeline. The fact that this didn't get off the ground. I'm angry. Especially since, one thing I forgot to mention is another aspect of this that kind of spoke to me is I am from a biracial family. Like, and the thing is, based off of when my father was born, I was this close to not even being allowed to exist. At least not in this country. So that, I think that's another thing that kind of always spoke to me about that, because like the fact that I was like a mere generation away from my family having their own issues in that regard. I've been told that my mother's side of the family was not that crazy about it. Actually, yeah, because they got married like after 3 months of knowing each other. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so I guess there's a reason that this always spoke to me.
Guess so.
I did just post the link to them canceling that production in the Discord.
Oh,
Thank
yes,
you. Yes.
I'm just pulling it up.
That
We
is just-
apologize. I'm deeply sorry for the offense and pain. I mean,
Yeah, no, fuck that so hard. Okay.
speaking of that, how about this movie?
Yeah, let's talk about
Doesn't seem
this
so bad now,
movie.
does it?
Oh,
I
here's the
kind
thing.
of liked it.
Okay.
Maybe part of it is because I really love like the backdrop. I mean, I think they shot it in Santorini, Greece for the entire movie. So
They did.
It's just gorgeous, and so there's a lot
Oh,
of
yeah.
really nice backdrops, nice silhouettes that are just like, oh, that's so pretty.
It is such a pretty movie.
It is very pretty. I feel like the movie I kept thinking about when I was watching it is, and this is a kind of a mean comparison because it's not as good as this movie, is Debs, where if this was like 2002 and literally the only lesbian movies I had were this, Bound, and Debs, this would have been my shit. This would have absolutely been my shit.
You know, that is so true. I hate that it's true, but it is.
It's my recurring anecdote about like how desperate I was for queer girl content in like 2006 is I watched the first episode of The L Word and I thought this is the worst piece of shit I've ever seen in my life, and I still watched 3 seasons to be sure.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Ellie, no. We do what we have to.
We do. We absolutely do. And that's actually a really interesting point. And it kind of does go to show how, in spite of how scary things are starting to get again for queer people, we really have gone far in terms of at least media representation.
We have
and that we
Portrait of a Lady
can.
on Fire now.
Exactly. So we can look at stuff that's, let's face it, mediocre at best and be all, you know what? I have better things I could watch. Like, I have the Carmilla web series right there.
To be clear, I am in favor. Like I said this after I don't remember the title of it. The Kirsten Stewart rom-com.
The Happiest Season.
That's it. I said this after that came out. Like, I am totally in favor. Like, I agree that queer people deserve, like, their Portrait of a Lady on Fire, their Oscar-winning, critically acclaimed masterpieces. But you know what? I sometimes want trash. Do I not deserve my lesbian, The Raid, just, like, absolute garbage TV?
Because that's
Actually, The
there's
Raid
not
was-
so much of it available that you can really sift through it and be like, there's some garbage over here, there's some better stuff over here, there's the, like, untouchable, perfect things over here, and it's just a nice mix.
But let's delve into this a little bit further. So basically, with The Kiss I Die, it is 800 years after the events of Romeo and Juliet, and we find out Juliet was turned into a vampire instead of dying.
What a great movie. I had to pause it like 32 seconds in, because it goes from the plague happened, a bunch of vampires found Romeo and Juliet, and now we're in Greece. And that's it. That's the whole intro that you get.
Yeah, what were the Greek vampires doing in Verona exactly? That like, I already have questions.
Fleeing the plague, they say, or something.
Run around.
I guess.
What else are you going to do as a vampire besides kick around Greece?
You know,
that's
if
a
we
fair
go into inside the plot idea, maybe it's because there's this whole thing where she can't drink the cancer blood because that'll make her sick, and so maybe they were having to move around because of the plague, and so they kind of ended up in Verona as
Okay, I guess that's fair. Okay, that's fair. I'll grant you that.
That's just a little bit of a stretch. That's me just totally jumping off.
That is you doing the legwork for the movie.
Yeah. Really are just like, there's vampires, Juliet's back, and she's a vampire, and we're in Greece. Yes, and, I guess.
And she has done nothing but mope around for all those 800 years, more or less.
She does mention that
And
she fucked Leonardo da Vinci at one point.
Yep, that is true, which, I mean, good for her, but still, it's basically implied that pretty much every night she watched the sunset and killed herself again, pretty much.
That's pretty
for a
hardcore.
very
I'm not gonna
long
lie.
time.
Good.
It is
It's a lot.
hardcore. It's one of those things where it sounds kind of cool at first, but then you start to think about it too much, which is what I do. And the funny thing is, like when I first heard about this, I was just so excited. It's Romeo and Juliet, it's vampires, and it's lesbians. And Juliet's played by this gorgeous woman. Give me now. And then I watched it and I was just like, well, this was a misfire. And this was finding that out was around the time when I started getting nervous. Because here's the thing, I'm not saying that I want Juliet to be happy right away, but the fact that this is like the bulk of what she has done for 800 years?
It's a little odd.
It's strange credulity.
I will say that,
Mhm.
you know, we mentioned that it was shot on location in Greece, and it does look really good. But between the very... And then this just sort of happens plotting. And I cannot overstate, like, audience, if you haven't seen this movie, I would guess that at least 70% of the dialogue in this movie is ADR.
Oh, yeah.
It's so pervasive that I genuinely went and looked up to see if it was a foreign production that got dubbed badly. And no, it just sounds like that.
I think I was watching that and I felt bad for them because there's some moments where you can hear the wind in the background and it's like they must have shot it and then they went back and listened to it and all they could hear was shh. And so then the
Almost
actors
certainly
have to go back and do it again and it's like,
and you know,
Right.
that might explain some of the performances.
Right, and ADR is basically any movie you've seen in your life has some ADR in it. It's a very common problem-solving tool, but if they use it that much, that means they had a lot of problems. And so between that, the on-location shooting, and the bare bones plot, I feel like this was originally a much longer movie, and then they blew too much of their budget, like getting to Greece. Like they had to hire a sound guy who didn't really know what he was doing. The special effects on the handful of times they show up, that is some Party City Halloween teeth going on there.
I've seen worse, but yes.
I mean, none of these things are deal breakers. I've seen worse movies, but like I watched Bit, but Bit kind of rules. Bit just kind of rips, and so if they just reset it to like, I don't know, Queens or whatever, and just lived with that being the setting, they probably could have shot more movie.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that this was probably edited to death, because I was thinking, like, there is a good movie trying to fight its way out of here. I was thinking, would it have been better if it had been allowed to be like a mini series or something? Maybe. Like,
or even just a full runtime, because it was a little short.
Yeah,
it was like 82 minutes, yeah.
So...
Yep, and as much as River in a previous episode had pointed out how much they missed 90-minute movies, there is a time when you really do need a longer movie, or you really need to cut some
that extra
stuff.
15 to get to the 90 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
My two favorite movies of the decade so far are respectively 3 hours and 88 minutes. So I like movies of all runtimes, but you need to use your runtime well, and I don't feel like this movie does. It has a lot of just very pretty but kind of pointless shots of Greece.
Yeah.
You can't, it's a B movie, you can't get away from it. You just can't.
You know, the funny thing is, I remember thinking with my last viewing of this, because of some of these beautiful shots, I really do wonder if this would have been better as a silent movie.
Oh, no.
Like that, like, and I feel terrible for saying that, but it's just, God, it's that ADR.
Silent, like, I've seen movies, like I mentioned my second favorite movie of the decade, We're All Going to the World's Fair, is very, very dialogue-like. But for that, you have to kind of subsist off vibes. And you are, especially if you're going to have a character who doesn't really interact with other people very much, which Juliet doesn't, you are so reliant on them to just hold up the movie. And that is a high wire act, and this actress, God bless her, I don't think she's up for it.
That's fair. I mean, in fairness, I think she had the best performance. I feel like she fared the best out of all of them.
Is that Ella Kwiku, our Juliet? She did a really great job.
Especially compared to all the other, I have to say, I think she was the one who fared the best. Like, she has a very commanding voice, which I think works for what they're trying to do with this Juliet.
She does a very good job. I feel like I'd like to see her in a performance where her voice isn't like... ADR voice is very sterile, especially when it's used this much. So I think Farron, I think she's pretty good. The two dudes who play like the villains...
They were having a good time.
They were. I will grant you that. All scenery diet.
I'm gonna make a lot of comparisons to a movie called Bit. Have
Yes.
either of you ever seen that?
I know of it because I'm a big fan of Nicole Maines.
Yeah, it stars Nicole Maines, for, again, audience if you don't know, is the actress who plays the trans superhero on Supergirl, which I haven't watched, but I love her.
Dreamer. I love her
it.
character. Also, she was famous for basically suing her school when she was like 15 to let her use the women's bathroom. So good for her there. Like, that's actually how she got famous before she was an actress, I think.
It too is a very, very clearly low budget lesbian vampire movie.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I think it does is, like, it also has, like, male villain who shows up at the last minute, but this dude, he doesn't really talk. He just kind of looks like, he honestly kind of looks like a more serious version of Matt Berry's character from What We Do in the Shadows.
Amazing.
Which now I want this dude in this movie replaced with Matt Berry.
Oh, that'd be fun. Oh, Matt Berry would kill this.
In New York City.
That'll be... Mwah.
I remember these family reunions being far more impressive. Soon it will be just you and me, huh, Father?
You really are the most devious bastard in
Santorini. But yeah, so we should probably get further into the plot. So Juliet's depressed. She's gets a little harassed by this dude in like a cafe, and there's this American girl named Farron, and they happen to lock eyes just after Juliet tells this guy off in a glorious way. I will say that was great.
I think it's like
Love at first sight.
exactly.
How do you know it was love, and not just a chemical response in the brain caused by erotic stimuli? After all, the only difference between love and lust is that the first one requires the intent of being with one and only one significant other. So unless you're going to drop down on one knee and pledge your everlasting love to me, do me the honor of fucking off.
And you can tell, like, again, clearly acting is not really the issue with girls here, because when they're just kind of looking at each other, you buy it. It's just then they make them talk.
The dialogue's very stilted, I think, in this movie.
Exactly. Again, I don't think it's really their fault, but between the fact that it's really not very good dialogue and the ADR that I didn't even realize is what this had to be, but once you point it out, it's so obvious to me now.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so they lock eyes, and then Juliet just leaves and gets cornered by this little boy who's got like quid pro quo or something carved into his stomach. Because I guess the head vampire is like summoning her or something.
Yep, it's just like, I found Romeo's body.
Yeah, because
so
Romeo's
he claims.
not in the movie. He's dead.
Nope. No, he's long dead.
He's just not around.
Yep, nope. For some reason, they didn't think to turn him.
He was stabbed, so maybe he, like, they can undo poison, but they can't undo...
Well, no.
Juliet was stabbed.
Juliet was stabbed.
Oh, then I got nothing for you. Yeah, the dialogue is very bad, but it's also not, like, meaningfully stylized in a way that would, on an objective level, like, Wes Anderson's dialogue is very stilted, but it's stilted in a very specific way that feels on purpose. If that's what they're trying to do, it doesn't really land,
Yeah, I don't think that's what they're trying to do at all, no. I think... Because honestly, I feel like they were kind of trying to kind of make it the modern equivalent of what Shakespeare did, but it's just like, no. Like say what you will about whether or not you buy that Romeo and Juliet were really in love. You bought that they thought it. Because that is some of the most beautiful romantic poetry Shakespeare ever wrote, I feel like.
Definitely.
Like, I feel like that is mostly what it lives and dies on.
I did like that part. This is kind of jumping ahead in the movie, but I thought that was a poetic thing with the ending, because I feel like a lot of people, when they read Romeo and Juliet, it's like, oh, well, they were kids. If they weren't kids, if Romeo had the emotional intelligence to wait a little bit, if they had just stopped for a minute and not be caught up in their teenage hormones, it would have been fine. And so this is kind of like, well, let's take literal Juliet, who went through this, and give her 800 years of living to grow and mature and become an adult. Would she still do the same action? Would she still do it again? At least for me, I think when it was kind of like, oh, like she still did it, the living for a moment, and then just like even with all of that knowledge and all of that growth from being a 12-year-old to being someone who's over 800 years old, it's like she still chose to die again for love.
Which is fair, but I also would point out clearly she was not really making an effort to have something to live for anyway. I mean, you're definitely right. It's for different reasons than just she's young and in love.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's like, actually, the ending bothers me because it's just like, okay, so what was the point of all of this then? Like, 800 years, and we end up in the same exact place.
This is sort of one of those things that makes me feel like that they needed a longer movie to make you buy it. Because no matter, like you said that it lives and dies on the poetry. What it really lives and dies on is whether or not you buy the romance. Because I've met people who don't buy Pride and Prejudice, and if you don't buy in, no amount of poetry is going to get you there.
And that's very fair.
There's a lot of stuff like that doesn't totally line up. Like they specifically talk several times about how Juliet was like 13 or 14. I think that she even calls the villain like a pedophile at one point. But she's an adult physically in this movie.
Yeah.
She was turned when what's going on? Like, how is this not in...
Well, doesn't she mention that she ages really slowly? And so I guess the idea that she looks like she's in like her 20s if she was 800 years ago.
That is true. She did basically say how I'm not immortal. I just age very slowly. This is very much a case of our vampires are different.
Yeah.
And they really drop a lot of vampire, I think, tropes from this movie.
Yeah, they can go out in sunlight is the big, because, why would you shoot Grease if you had to shoot everything at night? The important one, and you mentioned this earlier, is that they can, if they drink, what is the line? Dead blood?
Dead blood, yeah.
They'll die?
I mean, that's an Anne Rice thing. Not exactly the same, but it's a similar thing.
It is?
Yeah, if the Anne Rice vampires drink not fresh blood, they get like a nearly fatal case of food poisoning, basically.
So they can't, that's basically just keep them off drinking blood bags, is what you're saying.
Pretty much, yeah. Although I don't even know if that trope was really a thing when Anne Rice wrote them. Like, I definitely know it's a thing now because, again, I do engage with a lot of vampire media. Anyway. There are definitely rules to these particular vampires because pretty much any new vampire media is going to do different rules on it based off of what they need for the story or whatever the creators think is cool, basically. So yeah, we do learn they're technically not immortal. They just happen to age very slowly and what ends up being a plot point is they no longer see color. Yeah, so Farron actually ends up describing the colors of the sunrise and the sunset to her, which, like, that was cute. Like, that's one of those moments where it's just like, okay, I see a good movie fighting for its life in here.
Rest of the plot before we go to the rapid fire. So Juliet and Farron are two leads. They're making eyes. They're kind of falling for each other. Farron has cancer, so she's dying. Previously asked Juliet to turn her, and Juliet was like, no, like, I'm not going to turn anyone. I'm going to find Romeo and die with him again. Like, that's her plan. And the head of the vampires has told her, I found Romeo's body. You have to come talk to me. And that's kind of the driving force of the movie. And then when Juliet finds out that Farron has cancer, she's like, I can't turn you, like that will kill me and it won't work. And Farron's like, well, then we have, a day or two left before you have to go to this big vampire thing. So let's just make the most of it. They have a little romance. They have a little fling. It's very sweet. It's very pretty in the backgrounds. And then she gets kidnapped by the vampires. Juliet has to go to the main cave. And we learn that the head vampire is, like, old and he can't turn people anymore. And he wants to make Juliet, like, a full vampire. She hasn't, like, finished. Yeah,
she hasn't killed anyone yet.
She's got this dude. He's hanging around her the whole time. I think he's supposed to be, like, a thrall, is the logic train. At one point he starts, like, shedding his skin. I did not follow that.
I think what it is, it's just he's coated in makeup because he is very insecure about his age, we find out.
I thought that was a face mask that was peeling.
Yeah.
That does not look like any of the face masks I've done, so.
But no, I think that the point was, like, he's trying so hard to cover up the fact he is getting older.
Yeah, I don't get that character at all. He doesn't add a whole lot other than, like, whining in Juliet's ear about how you can't fall in love with this dude. You were in love with this other dude. 800.
Yeah, you can pull. It's funny you mentioned that though, because apparently they hadn't initially written this as a sapphic romance. Like initially they were going to cast a guy for the Farron role. Like Shami sent me this interview about it, but it just kind of naturally happened that way. So
I
that's
guess that
kind
kind
of
of makes sense because there wasn't. I mean, like there wasn't a point in the movie where it was like a girl. It was just like, oh, you're just falling in love with someone else. How dare you? You were in love with Romeo. You can't be in love with a different person.
Which is like, it's been 800 years. Leave her alone. Like, I realized she didn't think she could, but leave her alone.
Yeah, I feel like the movie doesn't really know what it's doing. Like, is this supposed to be seen as like she shouldn't be falling in love because the nurse is kind of a sympathetic character? I don't get what his deal is. What I'm supposed to get out of him.
He's supposed to be, yeah, but I don't know if it quite lands.
I must have found pretty irritating.
Face, love the beard mustache thing he's got going on. Fantastic.
Yeah, he clearly puts a lot of effort into his appearance because, again, he is very insecure about the fact he's getting older, especially when he's stuck with the forever young and beautiful Juliet. What you didn't mention is when Farron gets kidnapped, it's because he squealed about the whole they're planning on running away together because it's just like, okay, Farron, you really probably have like 6 weeks at most at this point. Let's just spend those together. Fuck my vampire family. Let's just go. I don't like these people anyway. Yeah, so Juliet does end up draining the guy to save Farron.
He goes over to the guy, and then the head vampire's like, oh yeah, like he did it so that he could have a place by our side. And our nurse character is like, oh, I get to be a vampire now, at last. And the guy's like, no, you don't. And the guy's like really sad about it. And then it's like, all right, Juliet, I'm either going to stab Farron or you're going to drain this guy and kill him and finish your transformation. And so then Juliet drains him. Our Farron dies anyway.
Yeah, and what we do find out is that, like you said, the nurse character is kind of complicated because the thing is, like we said, Juliet does kill herself with the very same poison Romeo drank pretty much every night at sunset. And so, I think his name is Amalthea. Yeah, he spiked the head vampire's, who they call father, blood with the poison, and he just McFrickin dies because, unlike Juliet, he has not developed an immunity to iocane powder. And so basically Juliet and Farron go fuck off, even though since Farron's been bitten, she doesn't have very much longer to go. And they basically end up going to like this cliff almost to just kind of watch one last sunset together. And once Farron dies, Juliet bites her and falls by her side dead.
Nice drone shot flying away.
Yeah.
That's the movie! There's your basic plot. All right.
Now let's delve into this further.
The whole like poison and dead blood switcheroo is one of the weirdest. Because like, okay, so they established can't drink Farron's blood without kicking him. Like instantly, like this, some bad guy vamp is gonna bite her in the third act and then die. Just instantly know it. What happened? But then. How did they spike, like, was it a sleight of hand thing that he spiked the blood that killed father? Like, what was going on there?
No, he just had Juliet's cross vial thing.
Right,
she
but
left it
did he drink
at
it?
The house.
Did
no,
he drink?
He when he poured his blood, he just added it to the blood, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, that is what I missed, because I couldn't figure out how that happened.
Yeah, I think that was a bit of a blink and you miss it sort of thing, but in fairness, I think that was the point.
Because they very much tried to hide that anything happened. Because they couched it before he drinks it, they're like, let's see how your old blood tastes. And then he drinks it, he's like, and then they continue on. And then he like laughs and he coughs, but maybe that's because he's an old vampire who can't like turn people anymore. And then he dies.
And it was pretty satisfying because he was a douchebag.
He has a whole entourage who were just kind of there.
Yeah, it was
they would do more with all of them, but they were just...
Especially as he's dying. But yeah, they're basically just there to show that he has a following.
Yeah. I kind of thought that there was going to be something where, like, maybe they would all, like I don't know, amass behind Juliet, be like, we're not taking orders from you, we're going to let you die, or something, but they were just kind of there.
Yeah, or at the very least, let Juliet fight some fuckers off.
Yeah.
Like, I think the implication was she's not as strong as them because she didn't fully complete her transformation, but still.
I thought it was because if she hasn't completed her transformation, she only had one set of fangs, and the other guy had 2 fangs.
That is true. I didn't even think of that.
He's a second level vampire with 2 fangs.
God, This guy made Tybalt in the Baz Luhrmann version look subtle.
Did they establish that the vampires have superpowers?
Not
No.
really.
I think they kind of reference maybe like super speed or something, because there's that point where Farron's like turning around and he's always on the other side of her.
Okay, that's something.
Yeah, he
They
was
really-
taunting her.
They really don't do a lot aside from the drinking blood and that they're immortal. That they're vampires.
That is actually a really good point. Basically, the only reason Juliet's a vampire is just like, okay, so how is she in the modern world? And also probably because, around the time this was being made, vampires were kind of having their post-Twilight second wind.
What's
I
happening
did
for
kind
this
of
one?
like that they didn't ever stop to be like, oh yeah, we're vampires, and here's our rules, and here's what we are in terms of vampires. They're just like, we're vampires. We drink blood.
Any modern vampire story needs to have your human protagonist basically go over the typical vampire cliches. Just because I feel like that's just necessary. Those need to be addressed.
Farron
And they
rolls
don't.
with the fact that Juliet is a vampire more or less instantly. He's like, I'm a vampire. Okay, cool.
Isn't she immediately like, you can turn me? Which I guess since she's dying, maybe that makes sense. But
Yeah, I can almost understand that for sure. But yeah, she like catches on very quickly. Again, she makes it look like Bella Swan gave it some thought.
Yeah, I keep feeling like there's gotta be some stuff that either hit the cutting room floor or they just never shot, because there's just so many, like, this happens. And, like, Farron in particular just, like, keeps bouncing back. Like, Juliet basically, like, does something that either abandons her or kicks her out, and then the next scene, Farron's like, I'm going back anyway.
Yeah, and one thing that really bugged me about this is that half the time you don't even buy that Juliet likes her, let alone loves her. You could have easily played it as if, she's trying to push her away, and I think that's what they were trying to do. I just don't know if they really succeeded.
So one of the things I was kind of curious about is, and they do sort of do this, is whether or not they're going to talk about like one of the things I feel like a lot of modern adaptations of Romeo and Juliet kind of have to go with is like this relationship is kind of immature and a little bit toxic and kind of overly intense, and all that's kind of true, but also it's a story. Like, I don't know. I feel like if they wanted to make it into a toxic relationship in this case, they could have leaned more into it. I was gonna say, I like killing Eve, and one point Villanelle kills Eve's ex-husband's new girlfriend, basically just because she feels like it.
Yeah, no, I can rock with a dark romance, but either you need to be the dark romance or you need to be true love. You can't really mix the two.
They don't really do either. They don't really. Well, they do true love. Like that's where they go at the end.
yeah.
But they don't really
that
make.
was the whole like with the saturation of the colors, like as they're looking at each other, and then they like it's like all warm toned, and then it goes back when they're like out of that like moment. Especially once you learn that it's like, oh, vampires can't see colors. So it's like, is she like seeing the color? Is the color coming back to her world, or is she just like getting that feeling or something?
Oh, it's
from
like
Juliet's...
the soulmate AUs.
Yeah, because doesn't she start Juliet starts the movie? She's like, I've only fallen in love twice. Once was 800 years ago, and the next was 3 days ago, or something.
It's all the more tragic, and it's just like, yeah, when is this narration happening? Like, is it like right when she's about to bite her?
I think that was in it must have been the point, because I think she was like in the bath, and then she like leaves, and that's when she leaves her little cross vial thingy to go.
I guess.
And
Okay, I guess I can see that.
Farron.
Yeah, this movie's like it is edited so weird.
Again, doing a lot of legwork for the movie.
You really are. You were giving it so much benefit of the doubt. And
I did like it.
Oh, I know. I believe you. And I'm glad you did. I really am. I'm glad somebody could enjoy this.
I definitely do agree with you. It's like, there's a good movie in here, and it's not quite there. They're really trying. They're not making it, but they're trying.
I do sort of wonder about the decision to make it have a tragic ending.
Like I said, like, what was the point then?
Like, I don't need a movie to have a point. Like, I don't mind tragic endings. I'm about to reference a much better movie here. So you're making a lesbian-flavored vampire romance that ends tragically. Okay, are you better than The Hunger? If not, you should, and that's sort of the thing. Like, that movie is very exploitative. It's very weird. But it's also very, like, stylish and intense. It's very sexy. Susan Sarandon has sex with both Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie in that movie. Oh man, I need to see that movie again. But my point is just like, I feel like if someone sat down, like, what is the selling point of this movie? I wouldn't be able to answer because I have no idea what I'm supposed to get out of it.
Well, if I may, because I was sold on this movie when I first heard about it. It's just, oh, so Juliet finds love again and it's with another woman, and 800 years later and she's a vampire? Sign me the fuck up. You'll notice that realizing that it is going to end tragically was not part of that. Because I think when I first watched it, I was going in thinking, oh, that's beautiful. She's going to find love again and it's gonna go okay this time, and nope. And in fairness, she warned us in the very beginning, but man, I guess I'm never allowed to judge people who are surprised that Romeo and Juliet ends tragically ever again, because definitely does happen, especially with first time readers.
I think this one ended more tragically. This one has a 4-person body count. The last one had 6.
That is also true. And also Farron was going to die pretty soon anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm happy or sad that they didn't pull some sort of like magic trick and be like, surprise, it did work. Not vampires anymore, or she did get turned successfully, or she's all cured now or something.
If they really wanted to mirror the end of Romeo and Juliet, then they would have had it that she stands up as soon as Juliet dies.
I was half expecting when Jock Vampire bites her, that to be like, it turns her. But then I don't know if they ever established a specific how to turn mechanic.
Not really, no. Which again, they really don't establish their vampire rules that well.
Yeah, they don't establish a lot of mechanics.
Part of what bothered me is that feels like it really was constantly going back and forth in terms of the development of Farron and Juliet's relationship.
They did a lot of like montage sequences where it's just kind of like you see them hanging out in one place and you see them hanging out in another place, and that's supposed to kind of fill in the gaps of like how they get more connected.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like with this sort of thing, you really do need to understand why they are connecting. Also, there were definitely moments when Farron as a character just bugged me, because like one minute she's being all kind and trying to help Juliet when she's super drunk, and the next minute when Amalfio is just like, who are you? And she's like, who are you? It's like, Farron, this is not your house. Like,
oh my gosh, I got so annoyed when Juliet's being her sad kind of mopey self, and she's talking about like, oh, there was this kid on the battlefield who then got shot by a cannon and he died with his guts all over the place. And so it's a nice monologue. It's very like, and so it's just like, okay, well, this matches Juliet. She's like she's sad. She's weighted down by all her years of watching people die, and Romeo's dead, and she's sad. And then it goes to Farron, and they're like in a church, and Farron's like, my mom had cancer and she died, and like everyone treated her differently or something. And I literally like paused the movie and shouted at the screen, you can't both be sad and mopey. We need someone to be another personality. I think it was just because it was back to back. That it was like,
yeah, this could have easily been a good grumpy sunshine romance.
yeah.
And I'm not even saying that she can't be sick, obviously. If anything, they would make the fact that she tries to be sunshine all the more poignant. Like, it's a bit of a cliche, but it works when it's done right.
So one of the problems I feel like is, I feel like the fact that Farron is sick comes right the hell out of nowhere. It is not really forced. Like, we know that her mom just died of cancer, so that's the only reason we saw her in the hospital in like a flashback at the very beginning. And we never get any indication that she's sick until, I want to say, like, Juliet like tastes her blood somehow.
Oh yeah, she Juliet has like a moment where she's like really like into this drop of blood on the table and just like very
which in fairness, you need that moment in a vampire romance.
Oh yeah, it's great. That was a fun moment.
It was.
Right.
And then she's like, how dare you? You're sick.
So if you wanted to make it more like a psychological, dark romance, you could have it like implied or even outright stated that like Farron is kind of manipulating Juliet in the hopes of getting turned.
Which, in fairness, if you had leaned into it, that's not something you see very often. Usually it's the other way around.
Right.
I've always wanted to see a human manipulate a vampire, because I think that'd be fascinating.
You should probably see The Hunger, Jasmine.
I've been meaning to.
It's real good. Like, The Hunger is also scary and sexy, and I don't think either of those terms could be attached to this movie. Like, it has a sex scene.
It's a very tasteful sex scene.
It's tasteful, it's pretty, but
it's not very sexy though.
I had this, I don't want to call it a talent. I used to be able to tell based on just like watching a lesbian sex scene in a movie, whether or not it was directed by a man or a woman previously the only movie that failed that test was Bound, and turns out I was wrong there.
We all were, in fairness.
And I could just tell, like, this is just not shot in a way that's interesting. Like, it's tasteful, but it's not tasteful in a way that makes it less of a sex scene, and it's not sexy. So what am I here for? What am I watching this for, buddy?
And again, if we bought more into the romance, it probably wouldn't even be a question.
Mm-hmm. It's not romantic, it's not sexy, it's not scary. What am I here for?
It feels like it's trying to be kind of all of it and therefore failing, even though there are definitely movies that do pull all of that off.
Being tasteful is overrated anyway.
Depends, but you're not wrong. But yeah, it's just like, because Juliet is often quite horrible to Farron, but Farron is also, I feel terrible for saying this considering what the character's gone through, but she kind of comes off as a bit of a brat sometimes.
I don't know. There's this idea that it's like, oh, if Juliet tries to turn her, then Juliet could die. But like no one knows that. Like Farron didn't know that until afterwards.
She tried to say that I did kind of know. It's just like, what?
Yeah, it's like, what?
How could you have known?
You kind of know. How could you know?
Juliet mentions like dead blood in her monologue about vampire rules.
I guess.
But that doesn't, like, I assumed they meant, like, drinking someone who's already dead.
Exactly, that's what I would have thought. Like, again, that would be doing a lot of legwork for this movie if we assumed that Farron should have gleaned that from that statement. Especially when it was, like, literally, like, 2 words in that whole monologue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then it's like during the point where Farron's like, oh yeah, like, I guess I could have known that it could have hurt you. She's like, I have leukemia, which is, like, specifically, like, a blood cancer. So maybe that makes a little more sense, but even that is very, like, it's like a throwaway thing.
It is. This movie wanted to be a lot of things that it definitely needed more fleshing out or more efficient writing.
I wonder what would have happened if they had that other 15 minutes to make it a 90-minute would stuff has changed.
I don't know. It so frustrates me because I should have been the easiest audience for this.
It also has like a really weird relationship with the text of Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, can I just say, it bothers me that she said that Shakespeare published it. It's like, no, that is not how it worked back then. Or at least not in the way we think of publication.
It's also just like, it's so weird because the in-universe explanation for Romeo and Juliet existing is that she told Shakespeare. But Shakespeare's play is an adaptation of an Italian novel, right?
Yep.
So, like, and that's one of those things that kind of, like, really bugs me, because that is the easiest thing in the world to Google.
It really is. It's the same thing that kind of bugs me with Shakespeare in Love.
Shakespeare in Love's a weird example, because I feel like I'm more forgiving to that because it does feel more stylized. Like, obviously there are no plantations in Virginia in Shakespeare's day. That ending makes no goddamn sense. But
as the resident not fan of Shakespeare, I feel like I thought that was because, like, okay, yeah, that's not where Romeo and Juliet really came from. But I feel like that would have made it more, like, clunky in that moment for her to be like, yeah, so I told my story to this guy in Italy, or, you know, I'll put in the author's name, and it's like, oh, I told this to this guy, and then this Shakespeare dude came by and turned it into a play. When
I'll grant you that.
Like, it's because she's also reading, like, the play.
She is constantly reading the play, which is interesting.
Like, it's very much like it's William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. It's not.
That is what the audience knows, and I will grant you that. But but Ellie has a point in that they could have pulled that off in a more stylized movie.
Or if, like, a lot of times with historical stuff, what's actually historically accurate feels inaccurate. Like, a lot of the stuff that people thought was completely absurd in The Favorite was completely historically accurate. But even when people thought it was inaccurate, no one really cared because The Favorite's vibes are perfect. It knows exactly what it's doing.
Yep.
Speaking of lesbian romances. But
so good.
I think that the fact that she states at one point that she's completely forgotten Romeo the person and only remembers him as Romeo from the play, that is the film's one stab at something interesting, and it just drops it immediately.
And you know what? I feel like that came from a good place because, you know, it's Farron, like, validating her. It's like one of the few moments where I'm just like, aw, about those two. Because, you know, it's like, you know, her validating her, trying to help her kind of heal what she's probably held onto her chest for centuries at this point. Like, We needed more of that. We really did need a lot more of that sort of thing where it's Juliet trying to heal from this trauma she has been stuck in for 8 centuries. And I think if they had focused more on that instead of Farron forcing her to do the open mic, for example.
Straight up.
That was such a weird moment.
That scene comes out of nowhere and then just immediately gets dropped. It's such a weird scene.
They wanted an excuse for the girls to sing, and I get it, but like there was definitely better ways to do that.
The thing that we've been whinging the most about is like the cancer plot, the vampire plot, which is just very bad. I straight up, Mr. Director Man, if you're listening to this, if you had made this like before sunset, but Romeo with Juliet and Farron is them hanging around Italy chatting about shit, about dealing with Juliet's trauma, I'd watch the fuck out of that movie.
Yeah, that actually would have been a lot better.
The writing has to be better, but you know.
Like, I really do think that everything we're whining about probably wouldn't even bother us so much if the dialogue had just been a little bit better.
Yeah.
But like Laura said, it's very stilted. It's very hard to buy.
You know what's a twist that I thought was going to happen in the movie, just because we brought up like, what if Romeo was there too, is there was a while where it was like, what if the nurse guy, what if he's Romeo? Or what if he's the head vampire or something like that? I don't know how that would have worked, but there was a part
I don't,
in my
but
head
I'm fascinated.
that was like, what if he was Romeo? And then I think that could have been a really nice like push and pull where Juliet's kind of in the middle between Farron, who's like, let's grow and change and like live in the world and not be stuck in the past of your old relationship, and the nurse character who is kind of like, you can't go with someone else, you're in love with Romeo, like you got to stay with your ex, like that's who your high school sweetheart, you got to stay with him, and it's kind of like, oh, this is your new love that you found somewhere else, but you can't go with them. And they could have had, I think, some like push and pull there, which maybe would have made his character a little bit more influential in the plot. That's why he wants her to stay with Romeo, because he's Romeo.
You know, with how invested he is in her whole dying with Romeo, I guess that it really is the only thing that would have made that make sense.
I wanted him to be something. I thought he was gonna, like, a reveal was gonna happen that he would be something.
The movie spends an awful lot of time on him. He is the only character who gets scenes to himself that doesn't involve either of the two mains.
That is actually really true. That's so weird. That is such a weird choice.
And, like, I talked a lot about how I feel like this is a movie that got cut down a lot. So here is your cheat code to understand movies. Every single second of a movie is really fucking expensive. That 20-second scene of him, like, pulling off his makeup or whatever, that scene took 12 hours to shoot. So the fact that they scripted it and storyboarded it and put it in the movie and it got through, like, they must have been going somewhere with him, but it doesn't really pay off.
The most we get is that he's bitter that she's young and he's not, basically. Or at least she's...
And that she
eternally
chose Farron over...
We already got that from their dialogue scenes together.
Well, he was kind of not revealing his true feelings. Like, she had even said, the reason I let him stay is because he never asked me to turn him.
I feel like the scene where he's pulling off his makeup is probably my, in abstract, favorite scene in the movie, just because it is the only scene that has, like, it feels like something.
It's trying to do something there.
I don't know, I've just been thinking about my, like, the vampire romance movies that I actually like. I'm thinking, like, The Hunger, I'm thinking Let the Right One In, I'm thinking Carmilla, and they all kind of have to deal with the elements of that I think this movie spends its entire time studiously avoiding in favor of a plot that doesn't really go anywhere. Like one of the best elements of Let the Right One In is the main vampire girl. It looks like a 12-year-old girl, and it's kind of implied that the guy she's with at the beginning of the movie has been with her basically his entire life, because that's basically what she does to the kid in the movie. Mm-hmm. And that's fucked up, and the movie knows that's fucked up, but that is dealing with, on some thematic level, the immortality versus mortality element. And this movie avoids dealing with that by putting, like, a very immediate ticking time bomb in Farron that I think is just lame. I think that's it. I think the movie would have worked a lot better without that.
See, I think it could have worked with that, because at the end of the day, it is something that a vampire wouldn't really have to deal with. And, like, that's the whole thing.
It is that, like, whole the human manipulating the vampire, as opposed to the vampire either manipulating the human or the human just being like, I'm so enamored, I want to live forever. As opposed to like, I am gonna die next week. I don't want to. Make me a vampire.
And it's just so frustrating because those are all fascinating ideas, but I just do not believe they pulled it off.
We kind of touched on the ending a little bit, but I do think that that's something that, and I don't know, because there's a part of me that's like, oh, well, Romeo and Juliet have to die at the end. Like, that's kind of the, like, Romeo and Juliet without them dying at the end. What is that? But also, it's kind of like, I wonder if sometimes the movies get trapped into, like, well, they have to die. We're going to make sure that they die at the end.
And I mean, that's kind of the nature of these old tragedies. It's just, it just keeps on happening. It's like a time loop. It's like the ending of Hades Town. We're going to sing it again.
I mean,
that would have been a cool ending. I fixed the movie. It goes the same. Juliet and Farron die, and then Farron comes back to life as a vampire, and now she's the Juliet who her lover died, and now she has to go on. And 800 years later, she falls in love with someone else, and then they die, and then the next person has to get up and keep going. And it's just a loop. It just continues.
See, this just reminds me of that one of my many works in progress that I've done in my life, where I basically made it that the whole Romeo and Juliet thing, it's a curse, basically. And my main character's best friend is the Juliet of this generation, so she's just like, oh, fuck no! We're not doing this!
I mean...
I love it.
The only adaptation of Romeo and Juliet that got famous enough to get its own remake, Juliet doesn't die at the end of that one. That's West Side Story. So I feel like it's not required that they die at the end.
No, there have been Romeo and Juliets where they just played as a rom-com, which is...
Romeo and Juliet.
I think that one of the reasons why I like foreign adaptations of Shakespeare plays, like, you know, Kurosawa was my favorite Shakespeare adapter, is that we in the West, especially in Britain and America, sort of end up putting these Shakespeare plays in glass. You know, they have to be reproduced a specific way, whereas other cultures and smart directors to that point will just look at them as, this is just a story. Maybe it's a really good story, but it's just a story. I can adapt it to my needs. Which, you know, on the one hand, they did sort of do that because Juliet pops back to life, but I don't know, I feel like it's such a goofy concept. Juliet is a vampire. I was expecting something a little more fun.
They don't lean into how much fun that could be.
It is not a fun movie.
Serious.
It's a very dour movie.
It is. And, you know, I get it to a certain degree, but I would have been much more interested in a Juliet that did have to figure out how to go on for 800 years without him. Because, I mean, part of the appeal of being a vampire is you could do whatever the fuck you want without the constraints of being a human. It's like, hell, I mean, I listened to this podcast called Reading Glasses where they mentioned how one of the perks of being a vampire is that you could go through your entire TBR list if you wanted now. You could literally just sit and read all day. And to be honest, that does sound kind of appealing. Or, like, it's even implied she has traveled the world. She has seen so much. And yet somehow she is still so dour. And I just do not buy the idea that, like, I can understand being tired of living, but I do not buy that she has found no joy in life in 800 years, because the brain's just not equipped to be constantly sad.
That's where the grumpy sunshine dynamic would have really helped. In that maybe she is just so sad because she can't find Romeo, and then that's just like a constant cloud over her head. And now she meets someone who's like, I'm about to die, but like I'm happy anyway.
I'm gonna try to make the most of it.
I think in all of my favorite immortality stories, I've been playing Elden Ring lately, and it has a lot of characters who are like functionally immortal, but who basically like forget everything about themselves. And I feel like, again, like the film's most interesting idea is that she doesn't remember Romeo the person. That's something that I try to occasionally tap into. I've told Jasmine about an idea I've had that involves that a lot. So I think that would be the... again, I'm going to put my hat in the ring that they should just make Before Sunrise, but with vampire lesbians. I think that the idea that life's finite element is what gives it meaning is something that I think most vampire stories... The audience is human. You kind of have to end with, like, being you rules, because you can't actually be a vampire, turns out.
No, shockingly.
That one countess in Hungary, I tried it one time. It didn't work out great. That was a dark reference. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. That was funny.
So I feel like that's the number one reason. But like the idea that the fact that you are going to die is what gives your life depth and meaning is a concept that I think a lot of immortality stories tap into. But this one doesn't really, like, because Juliet is determined to go off herself at Romeo's grave, they can't really go with that, because the point of that has to be, especially if Farron is dying, has to be, I'm eating shit in 3 days, lady. You've got the next 300 years to deal with this. What are you moping about? Like, that has to be the way they handle it.
That actually would have been a lot more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
They did have a moment with that where Farron,
Yeah.
I think it's right after the weird open mic scene where Farron's like, I think we have a couple hours before your vampire meeting. Let's make the most of it, sort of thing.
And they did not earn that moment at all, is the problem.
Yeah. And then they didn't really have the moment. They were just like, we're going to do this moment.
Because, singing open mic was definitely something that Juliet was dying to do.
Or that Farron was doing. She was a photographer. Why is she suddenly singing it? Where did she get the guitar? Did she have it?
I feel like they felt like they needed that scene because, like, indie romances usually have something like that, I guess.
They do very little with the idea of her being a photographer, too. I kept expecting that to come back. Doesn't really.
I mean, Juliet briefly mentions how she's trying to capture every moment. Like, it's very brief, but it is there.
Right. It's got all these ideas running around, but it has to, like, you have to zero in on one idea and actually do something with it.
Hey folks, Editor Jasmine here. It occurs to me that if they had gone with the ending that Laura pitched, where Farron ends up waking back up and it turns out she is a vampire now, her taking her photographs would have actually had meaning, especially if she had taken photos of her and Juliet. That would have been how she remembers Juliet, the same way Juliet had the play to remember Romeo by. And that could have added some symmetry from the beginning to the end. God, this movie is so frustrating with its wasted opportunities.
Either they needed to slim this down or bulk it up.
Now, even if you're bulking it up, you need to have an idea, because, a mess that's twice as large is still a mess.
That is true. You're not
A
wrong.
little more focus, a little more time.
A little less conversation, a little more action.
Since we are kind of talking about how this kind of does fail as a Romeo and Juliet sequel / adaptation, what is it about this play that still endures after all of the many criticisms people keep on levying at it, whether it's fair or not?
So, to open, I will say that part of the problem with the classics is that they are a self-perpetuating cycle.
For sure.
You have people who are taught these things are good, so that becomes their standard of good, so things just like them are made, so that remains the standard of good. And that's true for all mediums. I don't know if any of you follow film criticism, but like a Belgian movie called Jeanne Dielman was named the #1 movie of all time at the Sight and Sound poll last year, and people who had grown up hearing like Citizen Kane and Vertigo and The Godfather and Grand Illusion, these are the best movies of all time, lost their shit. They were furious about this movie getting to #1. So I feel like
I think I heard of that. Yeah.
I feel like on some level classics do become a self-perpetuating cycle, especially classics that have lasted as long as Shakespeare. But I do feel like there is such a very basic core of these two people who want to be together, but society has these arbitrary, and in the original play, completely arbitrary rules. They are the same social class, they are the same age, they are the appropriate genders for the time period, and that arbitrariness of like them being pulled apart is what makes, I think, Romeo and Juliet persist, because it basically always asks, why the fuck can't they be together? What's the deal, guys?
Yeah, I fully agree, Ellie. I think it's very much that kind of, like, relatability. Everyone's probably either had a relationship or just had a crush that it was like, well, we can't be together for some reason. And I think when you read Romeo and Juliet, I think it's very easy to be like, oh, well, I'm kind of like Juliet, or I'm kind of like Romeo, and my crush, or the person I want to be with, is the other one. and there's just something that's keeping you apart, but what if you tried? And then I think there's something very romantic about being like, my love is so important that it would be an entire story, and it would break the hearts of the entire town because we both died, and everyone would be sad. Didn't let me kiss him, you know?
If anything, as we keep on expanding what is quote unquote allowed in relationships in society, I think that is just part of what's going to keep it evergreen, because while yes, the text itself is, unless you count Mercutio, of course, is very hetero, but then again, it would always be two men playing it back in the day, for one thing.
I do think that the poetry, like, more than just being beautiful poetry, it kind of, obviously, I feel like, no, don't actually want a relationship that's this intense, but like a lot of the language in there very much taps into what you want, how you want your relationship to emotionally feel. You know, my love is as boundless as the sea. So I think that if you, especially when you're young and your crushes become like world-ending things, it is very relatable. It is very idealized.
Yeah. Young love, it's very powerful. And it should be allowed to thrive whether or not it will last. Because people are always wondering if Romeo and Juliet are really in love. And to me, I feel like that kind of misses the point of the story. Is like, whether or not they are, they clearly believe it. And they should be allowed to explore that.
Yeah. And I think there is something to the fact of, like, if you're in love, does it matter if the love is going to last? Like, if this is the be-all, end-all relationship, which kind of even goes into that idea that, like, it's got to be, like, two people monogamous forever and that's it. As opposed to, like, this is who you're in love with right now. And in 30 years, who knows what's going to happen? You could be totally different people. And... you know, but that doesn't change the fact that right now, especially when you're young, it's like, that doesn't change the fact that right now, this is how you feel. This is what...
right now, it matters.
I remember I once posted on Twitter, girls don't want to hear I love you, girls want to hear, and I don't remember what the exact quote, it was a quote from This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is an incredible book if you haven't read it. And someone like popped into my mentions to be like, you know, that's a very intense level of emotion for a relationship. It might be a little unhealthy. And I just sort of fall back on my default comment. Just, it doesn't need to be healthy. It doesn't need to last forever, because these characters cease to exist when I turn the last page. They're done. They're done. That is how long this level of emotionality needs to feel authentic for the runtime of the play or the book or the movie. And Romeo and Juliet feels very, like, I authentically buy that Juliet would feel like she finds her boyfriend dead. Like, well, it's stab time, babe.
Yeah. And
it's also like in the moment. I can only imagine. Like, if I found my partner dead, like, I don't know. If you give me 5 minutes, maybe, but would I give myself 5 minutes in that moment? I don't know.
Yeah, but Larry is a very awesome guy, so I don't blame you. With all that said, I just do not believe that, other than maybe just the fact that she was already clearly sick of life, that Darren and Juliet would be cool with dying for each other. Because it is so impressive, honestly. Like, realistically, they haven't known each other much, any less than Romeo and Juliet did, but it just does not click the same.
I do feel like there's an element where Juliet killing herself at the end of this play is almost like a semi-comedic beat. It's like, okay, this happened again. This time I'm doing it right.
Kind of, yeah.
Didn't she mentioned that earlier in the movie where she's like, and it would have worked too if
it weren't for those meddling vampires.
For those meddling.
Ruh-roh. Anyone got stuff to plug?
I got a Twitter, LSR42. I got a Tumblr, Football and Tuxedos. I hypothetically have a podcast where a friend of mine and I are covering every episode of the TV show High School, and also at the same time reviewing the Tegan and Sarah album that has the song that the episode is named after. We've only done one episode. I'm hoping to do another one this weekend. Watch High School. High School's real good.
I am Pim Leepet everywhere on the internet. PIMLEEPET. Sometimes there's a dash in there. Sometimes there's not. Find me. I'm everywhere. That's the name.
And you can find me at Faye Riviera on Twitter, Tumblr, and TikTok. I also do have a YouTube channel where you can find select clips from episodes of this very podcast at Faye Riviera Productions. And coming up next, it's our first theme month, Gatsby Month, because what better way to celebrate America's birthday than with a story all about how the American dream is futile? And how will we be starting this on July 3rd? Well, obviously with the one you all probably thought of first. That's right, the 2013 film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, directed by Baz Luhrmann. Excited to see you there, and remember, stories gain power in each retelling.
A glooming peace this morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence, to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned, and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.